Hello and welcome to the Beyond the Binary audio described exhibition tours. My name's Josie Kettle and I'm the project curator for Beyond the Binary, a National Lottery Heritage funded exhibition based at the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford. I'll just tell you a little bit about what I look like. I am 5'10", I've got dark mid-length hair, I'm wearing a black jumper and I've got green jeans on today. I'm standing in our temporary exhibition space, which is situated in the modern extension of the museum, and that's attached to the Victorian feeling main galleries, which were built in the 1800s. There's a really different feel as you move through the museum to this space. The exhibition space itself has been taken over by the colours of the trans flag. So the walls are covered in light pink, bright blue and white. It was really important to us and our partners, community partners, that we stood up as a museum as an ally, particularly for the trans community. So we wanted people walking into this space to unavoidably experience the trans flag. As you move around the exhibition, you'll see those colours repeated again and again. We also didn't want the stories of queer life experiences that this exhibition shows to be segregated to this one space. So we've worked with our partners to develop interventions, 12 of them, which have been placed all around the historic galleries. So as you walk through the really dark Victorian feeling galleries, visitors are going to encounter objects related to Beyond the Binary, which we thought was really important to bring the main museum into conversation with this history. The main driver of this exhibition has been about getting the museum to rethink how we work with partners, how we work with communities, and to open up the kind of stories that we tell in the museum space. We wanted to challenge the traditional hierarchies, which often see a single curator presenting the idea of a single truth, or an idea that an object can be understood from one particular perspective. What we've tried to do is work with multiple different groups, voices, so activists, researchers, artists, Indigenous partners. We've made links all over the globe, and we've tried to bring their voices together into this space using the collections of the Pitt Rivers Museum to talk about their experiences of their own queer life stories. So this exhibition celebrates material that was already in the Pitt Rivers Museum, so material that might be from ancient Egypt or Rome, through to material that was collected really locally to Oxford, so in Berkshire or Cowley Road, which is just a mile or so away. The material selected for the exhibition has queer origins, can be read as queer, or can facilitate the sharing of queer stories. Before you walk into the space, you encounter Oxford-based activist Trans Happiness is Real's Frankenstein hanging, a powerful and emotive assemblage of fabrics that has been embroidered, screen-printed, stamped and inked by activists' collaborators. The patches have been stitched together into a beautiful, strangely beautiful, Frankenstein quilt, to use Trans Happiness is Real's own description, and it's covered with messages such as bodily autonomy now, or demands for bodily autonomy, and comments like gender has always been complicated. It's about 3 metres by 3 metres, and it is impossible to avoid as you walk into the exhibition. You then move into the exhibition space, which is split into several sections. We start with an introduction, which includes a cartoon discussing queer terminology. There's a section on Indigenous power, a section on countering colonialism. The next section is rituals and identity. Then we move to representation and activism, then objects of power, and we end with a library section and an interactive feedback area. The feedback sections have really taken on a life of their own. They've been one of the most exciting parts of the exhibition for me. So we have a toilet wall that people can draw on, which is quite anarchic, and school kids particularly really enjoy that. We also have a Stonewall Hopes for the Futures board where people can pin their messages of affirmation for other members of the community, and the board itself is becoming layered with some really beautiful, meaningful comments, which we love sharing over social media. In this exhibition, you'll find a real mixture of material, a really eclectic arrangement of objects from around the globe and from across time. So alongside a really contemporary phone box, life-size phone box, you'll find next to that ancient archaeological material from ancient Egypt, from Rome, from Greece. You'll find a Beastie Boys t-shirt from the early 2000s. You'll find Doc Martens from the 1980s. And you'll find imagery that was taken in the late 1900s alongside photography that was shot in 2002, for example. It was really important to us that we didn't limit the type of material that we brought into the exhibition, and that it was our community partners that chose what they wanted to see. Objects were chosen for the exhibition that meant the most to our community partners and told us a story that they specifically wanted to share. I think this diversity of material reflects the diversity of the lived experiences of the queer community itself. The community is diverse, it's broad, it's not one thing, and I think that also reflects everyone's life experiences. We're not one thing, we're not one identity, but we're a mixture of lots of experiences. So I hope you enjoy the rest of this tour. You'll now meet some community curators, and we'd love to hear your feedback. We'd love to hear what you thought about the tour, about the exhibition itself, and also what your hopes for queer representation in museums might be going forward. You can find us on social media, tweet us and Instagram us, and we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Hello, I'm Lance. I've been really fortunate to be involved in the Beyond the Binary exhibition as a community curator. So I've contributed in very small part to this huge, diverse, amazing exhibition, and thank you for coming along to see it. My contribution has been the trans mannequin, which you can see behind the phone box over at the back of the exhibition space. So I transitioned around 5 years ago. I now use he, him, or they, them pronouns. And this mannequin is to highlight not only my experience, but also other experiences in the community in Oxford. You might begin to see representations of social transition and trans people more generally in the media at the moment. But hopefully, this mannequin can show a slightly different, slightly more relatable view of that process. So you can see that the mannequin is dressed in a grey t-shirt, which has the Beastie Boys, a photograph in the centre of the t-shirt, and the words Beastie Boys in green writing. So even though this t-shirt isn't a particularly strongly masculine or feminine item, and in many ways could be described as unisex, or maybe even non-binary in itself, it was a really big part of my social transition because it was given to me by a friend when I came out. And this act of giving something was a huge act of validation, and really shows to me that there's a great deal of interpersonal interaction, there's a great deal of uncertainty, and there's a great deal of confirmation which can be gained through the way that someone presents. And that's so much more than someone wearing a suit to a black tie dinner instead of an evening dress that they might have worn in the past before they came out. Also contributed to this wonderful mannequin are many other items that don't belong to me, but tell an important part of the trans community's story. We have the Doc Martens donated by someone else who has had a fantastic input into the exhibition as a whole. We have the tattoo of Fernando the Bull, who is a wonderful fictional character of someone who rejected toxic masculinity, but not necessarily for stereotypical or what one might call toxic femininity in his story, choosing instead to demonstrate his gender based on his approach to these traits and what he wanted to see in himself. We also have various fidget toys. So you might remember the spinners that were so popular. They were everywhere in 2018 and 2019. And although the fidget spinner is an item of fun, it's also a socially acceptable way for many people to manage their anxiety or to manifest neurodivergence. It was important to include the fidget spinner as part of this mannequin, as a recent study has shown that over 98% of people in Oxford who identify as trans and or non-binary experience difficulties with their mental health. And these difficulties are not necessarily only due to the rigours and trials of transition and living in a gender that you don't identify as. And therefore, ability and mental health are also part of the landscape of gendered presentation and self-acceptance, and ultimately presenting as yourself. I hope that this mannequin gives you the opportunity to reflect on how you interact with your own gender and the vocabulary that you might use or might avoid to describe it, and how you categorize yourself and how categories can help us to better understand others and equally limit our understanding of the infinite complexity of other human beings. I've been very fortunate in that I've not only been able to contribute to the trans mannequin and the temporary exhibition space, but also to contribute an artefact that is of great personal significance to me to the main exhibition hall. You will find Soft, the gosling finger puppet, in the representations of animals cabinet on the top shelf. Soft is a finger puppet around 5 centimeters tall. Soft has a lovely, soft, yellow plush fluff and a slightly more coarse and interesting dappled grey on the back and wings. Soft has a pleather beak and bright, beady, googly eyes. The reason that Soft is incorporated into this exhibition is to represent another important chapter in my life, which is about self-acceptance and which I hope is meaningful to you too today. When I first came to Oxford, I wasn't sure where I belonged, and I really struggled with the conflict between different aspects of my identity, being from a not very academic family, but performing well academically. How could I square my relationship to myself and the social class that I came from? How could I understand my sexuality in an environment where female-female friendship expressed itself in a very different way, and suddenly it wasn't romantic, it could just be platonic to want to hold a girl's hand, for example, or it could just be seen as an aesthetic statement to dress in men's clothing. My relationship to myself had completely been thrown into array. And this was when I befriended the geese in Port Meadow. I hope that you have one day a chance to visit them yourselves. The grey-lag geese form these wonderful families. They're not nuclear families necessarily, although some of them are. Parents form strong bonds that may be single or between groups of 3 or 4 adults. And in addition to their own goslings that are their biological offspring, they adopt others. When they say a lost Canada gosling, for example, which to my eye is a completely different size and shape and even colour. They're so much more yellow than the muted greyish brown of the grey-lag goslings. But they don't see that difference. What they immediately see is a kinship, and they make these wonderful patchwork chosen families consisting of goslings of all different sizes, even across species boundaries. They've even been known to adopt cygnets, which are baby swans. And it was seeing these families and being accepted by them in my small way when I bring them some grain to eat that helped me accept myself and see myself as being beyond the binary categories that I felt were being offered to me in my late teens when I came down to the academic city of Oxford. If you'd like to visit Soft, he's on the ground floor in the main exhibition space. If you're entering from the Natural History Museum, you can come down the main stairs, and then in the front row of glass cases on the right is the Animals in Art case. Soft is round the back of this case, so do walk all the way around if you can. Soft's case is very different from the temporary exhibition space in that it's crowded with a larger number of really vibrant objects across all different cultures. Some people love the richness of having all these different objects and cultures represented so closely together, although we understand that it can be overwhelming for some other visitors. If the main exhibition space seems slightly overwhelming to you, I would still encourage you to have a look, if you can, in our temporary exhibition space for Beyond the Binary. We have a lot of colour and objects, but they are more widely spaced, and there are plaques on the wall to help guide you along your journey. We know that many queer people, including myself, are non-neurotypical or neurodivergent. And please note that this is something we have considered in our exhibition format, and we would love to know how you interact with the space and how it makes you reflect on your own perceptions of the museum as a whole.
Hello, my name is Dan Lorne. I am a Métis artist and community curator with the Beyond the Binary exhibition project at the Pitt Rivers Museum. Today, I'm wearing black-rimmed glasses, I have short brown hair, and I'm also wearing a dark red sweater with a black undershirt with tiny white polka dots. As a community curator for the Beyond the Binary project with the Pitt Rivers Museum, I was given the wonderful opportunity to engage with the museum archives, specifically objects that have been made or created by my own nation, the Métis Nation. I was fortunate to work with some specific objects like the S Black bag, and even curate and create art in homage to that bag with my own artwork. I have also represented the project Beyond the Binary at other events held by Oxford, in London and other areas, and I have been fortunate enough to work on a few educational workshops as well as an online webinar produced by the Education Department and the Pitt Rivers Museum. So the Métis community is a historic community spread across through Western Canada, as well as a couple of other provinces with some communities in the northern United States. Traditionally, it has been a community that is a melding of different cultures. You have predominantly European, inexact English and French that came to Canada, or what is now known as Canada, for the fur trade. We also have a melding of Indigenous communities, or First Nations communities as they are known today in Canada, Anishinaabe, Cree, as well as other cultures, and those two communities melded together and fortified to become the Métis Nation that we know today. I am a product of the Métis Nation, specifically the traditional territory in Red River. That's where my family hails from, and I am very pleased to be keeping on with certain traditional activities such as beadwork, baking, bannock, and also attempting very trepidly to do the Métis jig. Situated up high in the middle of the glass case labeled Indigenous Power Countering Colonialism, this object is a large black woolen bag decorated with Métis beadwork that exemplifies a combination of European and Indigenous artistry. The bag measures around 610 millimeters in length, or about an average person's torso, and it is the width of about 280 millimeters, or about the length of a person's forearm. Rounded at the top, the bag tapers down sharply, with 8 tabs dangling straight down, wherein they split in half at about an inch towards the end of the cloth. The cloth tabs end in chains of 3 translucent blue and brown beads. At the end of every beaded chain are an inch of thread tassels, weathered and browned with age to show a mixture of cream and chestnut-colored pigmentation. Now, razor thin, this bag's edges are piped with tiny scuffed white beads along a thin line of dulled red ribbon, sandwiched between another single line of yellow beads. The front panel of the bag is decorated with finely stitched cotton thread in the shape of several flowers, including drooping tulips, crescented bluebells, and a couple of 4-petaled prairie roses. These flowers, though made with European materials, accentuate Métis worldviews and designs. Given as a gift to Scottish fur trader Samuel Black in the early 1840s, it was probably made by one of Black's Métis wives or daughters living in what is now Western Canada. We know this because it has the initial S. Black stitched in delicate thread underneath the cluster of flowers. Each of these 8 dangling tabs is also decorated with leaves and vines in a swerving zigzag that are consistent in placement. The facing panel in the display case shows the flowers filling up the 4 corners of the cloth, representative of the 4 cardinal directions that are sacred to the Métis community and other Indigenous communities. The next object, made by Dan Lauren in 2019, is also a bag of similar shape, though it is half the dimensions and size of the Samuel S. black bag. However, it is also made from felt, cotton thread, and multicolored glass seed beads. It hangs to the right of the display case, suspended by a single rainbow ribbon an inch wide, protruding from the left and right corner of the bag's opening. This bag features a red heart, representing love, made from 3 lines of beadwork with red and pink lipped rosebuds nestled in the middle of the heart. A blue and white beaded purple tulip, nestled at the top of the heart, also has a bright yellow stamen that guides to the top of the bag. 2 sets of green beaded foliage are at either side of the heart, and towards the very bottom of the heart is a large swash of rainbow ribbon. 4 felt tabs drop down, wherein they split in half about an inch towards the end of the cloth. A single line of rainbow beads at the end of each tab feeds into a cluster of threads tasseled in alternating colors of white and cobalt blue, the contemporary flags of the Métis Nation. Beadwork decorates each tab with designs of pastel blue roses, green veined leaves, 4-petaled roses, red strawberries with white polka-dotted seeds, small white flowers, and copper-colored vines swerving in the middle of every tab. Both bags represent a combination of identity, European and Indigenous storytelling told through artistry, with thoughts such as affection, gender, and identity. I felt inspired by the S. Black's bag creator to make my own bag that showcases my feelings as a transgender Native man. When I was transitioning, I was convinced by Western colonial standards that I could not enjoy or like anything feminine, especially the typical floral beadwork of my Métis community. However, beadwork is often viewed by many to be a strictly feminine art form, which is the farthest from the truth. Beadwork merely shows another way that Indigenous people can express their identity, honor their ancestors, and create traditional works of art in the present day. Beadwork has been an important part of me engaging with my community and expressing myself and my identity that lies beyond the binary.
Hello, I'm Mara Gold. I was the researcher on the Beyond the Binary exhibition, which we're looking at today, which is part of the Beyond the Binary project at the Pitt Rivers Museum. So I'll describe myself first. I have shoulder-length, curly, blue and grey hair. I'm white. I'm wearing a short-sleeve yellow shirt with the characters from The Wizard of Oz on it, with a black suspender skirt. And I'm wearing red lipstick and black eyeliner. The exhibition was only one part of the Beyond the Binary project. The project itself was looking at kind of queering and questioning the museum's collections. And what I mean by that is sort of, we started off by really looking into what the Pitt Rivers already had and how we could tell LGBTQIA+ stories from those. Not necessarily using those terms, because those are very Western terms, but it was helpful for us in terms of framing the exhibition. And so we also have interventions. So there's a trail you can do around the main galleries following these 12 interventions, some of which are done by community curators, some are done by artists, Indigenous artists, for example, activists, some are done by myself. And it really kind of picks out different objects in the main galleries that we really want to sort of make a statement about, either in terms of LGBTQ+ histories, or also in terms of decolonizing histories, which have a lot to do with kind of gender presentation in some of the communities that are displayed in the Pitt Rivers. So for example, in the Pacific Islands and New Zealand, there were different gender identities that were criminalized by the British, for example. So things like that we're really kind of looking at because, as you may know, the Pitt Rivers has quite a problematic history in terms of colonization, in terms of acquiring objects from different parts of the world. So we really needed to address that while we're looking at LGBTQ+ histories, because they really cannot be separated when you're doing this kind of work. It's really important to look at them in tandem. So one key aspect of the Beyond the Binary project is to also look at decolonizing and looking at decolonizing and queering as hand in hand. You can't really separate them on a project like this in a museum like the Pitt Rivers, largely because a lot of the British and other European colonists actually made certain gender and identities and sexualities illegal. Identities that were, completely sort of normal for those areas beforehand, and they, sort of tried to eradicate them, partly for religious reasons, but partly because, it gave them power to kind of criminalize identities that were sort of normal as part of those cultures. So when you actually come to the Beyond the Binary exhibition, you're sort of faced with that kind of problematic colonial history as you actually come through those main galleries in order to get to the temporary exhibition space. So you really kind of get this idea of what the Pitt Rivers has been doing in the past and what we're trying to do today in terms of decolonizing the actual museum and seeing kind of new objects or objects framed in a different way. So one of the most important parts of the exhibition, or the way that the exhibition was curated, was working with both community curators from the local community, as well as international Indigenous artists and activists who were able to sort of make their own responses to objects already in the museum, as well as contribute new material. And so the community curators, as I said, were more sort of local. They were able to respond in a huge variety of ways to the objects the Pitt Rivers have, and again, some of them contributed new material. So we've got poems, we've got beadwork, we've got more traditional kind of academic responses, and community curators kind of curated everything from whole sections to just sort of individual objects. So they were really able to sort of choose how they got involved. In terms of working with Indigenous artists and activists, it was really, really important for us to kind of get their responses to the objects, particularly because a lot of these objects had been taken violently from their communities historically. So it was really important that we kind of get their words in the museum today. So as you may be aware, the exhibition is titled Beyond the Binary, Gender, Sexuality and Power. So I'm going to talk a bit about the power aspect of the exhibition. In terms of power, part of it we're talking about kind of activism and that kind of power, but we're also talking about faith, spirituality and witchcraft, my favorite. One of the most famous objects in the Pitt Rivers itself is the witch in the bottle. And I am here holding the handling version of the object, just so that I can describe what it feels like a little bit more. So I'll describe how it looks first, and then we'll talk a bit more about the context and some other objects that relate to it. So the witch in the bottle is approximately 11 centimeters high. It's made of glass. It has a sort of silver finish to it. It's pear-shaped, so it's wider at the bottom, and then there's a little sort of bump towards the neck of the bottle, and then the top. It's got red wax seal on it, and it has these ridges that run vertically down the bottle, so when you sort of run your finger along it, you can sort of feel these quite nice smooth ridges going right round the bottle. So the bottle, it was collected by the museum in 1926, but it was actually collected by its original owner in 1915 in Sussex. And the bottle was collected by Margaret Murray, a folklorist and archaeologist. She was originally actually an Egyptologist, but during the First World War, when she couldn't work as an archaeologist, she got really interested in British folklore, and that's when she started developing what she called her witch cult theory. So one interesting thing about this particular witch in the bottle is that it supposedly contained the ghost of a male witch. Now in England, most of the people persecuted for witchcraft were female, and part of that was to do with kind of gender non-conformity and sexuality. But we do there are few cases where we hear about kind of male witches. So I thought it was pretty interesting in terms of gender, because the stories of male witches that we do know, again, a lot of them were gender non-conforming and gay. So this could have been referring to a kind of LGBTQIA plus witch in some way, or a non-conforming witch at least. So I think that's really interesting in terms of LGBTQ plus histories. But also the wider history of the persecution of witches is really, really interesting in terms of the LGBTQIA plus community. One, as I said, because a lot of the LGBTQ plus community were persecuted as witches. It was an easy way for them to kind of persecute things like gender presentation and sexuality, particularly when there weren't laws around them. So there weren't necessarily laws around women having sex with each other. There were for men, but not for women. So it was kind of an easy way to grab them, accuse them of being witches. But also, in a more positive light, although there's this kind of history of oppression, in a more positive light, the LGBTQIA plus community has actually they're sort of drawn to witchcraft and drawn to sort of esoteric things, the occult, astrology, all that sort of thing. And I think in a way, it's kind of reclaiming that oppression in one way. And another way, it's kind of, finding power from it. But also it does kind of, there were these kind of long connections, even though a lot of the accusations were false. There are long histories of queer people in the past kind of engaging in these practices. So it's not completely false, but we do have to sort of look at things with a cynical eye, I guess. So the bottle is also interesting in terms of its collection history. As I mentioned, Margaret Murray was the archaeologist and folklorist who collected this object. And she, in 1921, published a book called The Witch Cult of Western Europe. Now, this book became actually quite popular, both academically and culturally. For example, the lesbian author Sylvia Townsend Warner in 1926 published the book Lolly Willows, kind of about a satanic lesbian, really. It was satire, but that was very much based on Margaret Murray's witch cult work. And so other people also were influenced by this work. So, for example, Vita Sackville-West, another author, she was really interested in the work that Margaret Murray was doing about Joan of Arc. So one of the main features in this witch cult book was a section on Joan of Arc, and really kind of basically, instead of saying that Joan of Arc was, a Christian saint, that she martyred herself for her Christian beliefs, that actually she was a witch and she martyred herself for her kind of, occult beliefs. And so she really kind of got into this idea. She kind of got into what she thought these witches were doing. It was very much kind of based on ancient deities, worshipping ancient deities and that sort of thing. And she developed this whole idea, and she was convinced that people were still practicing witchcraft in this way. And then again, later in the 70s, her ideas were picked up again by gay activists particularly. One quite well-known book is Witchcraft and the Gay Counterculture by Arthur Evans, which is pretty much based all on Margaret Murray's witch cult work. Again, Arthur Evans brings up Joan of Arc, but instead of kind of talking about Joan of Arc in terms of kind of sacrificing herself for being a witch, it's talking about Joan of Arc of sacrificing herself for being queer, for being a lesbian and possibly trans or a cross-dresser. And when I'm referring to Joan of Arc here, I'm using she pronouns because Margaret Murray and Arthur Evans used them. But Joan of Arc could have a variety of different pronouns, so that's why we kind of chose not to give Joan any pronouns in the exhibition. So another history of gender that's very much related to witchcraft and very much related to sexuality in the LGBTQIA plus community is the idea of the wandering womb and hysteria. So you may be familiar with this kind of 19th century idea of hysteria. I think there's been some films about it, whereby they kind of considered that women's issues or people born with a uterus, that their issues were all based on something being wrong with this uterus. And the fact, it dates back to ancient ideas, whereby the uterus, they called it the wandering womb, and it would sort of apparently would wander around the body when there were issues going on, and they had to sort of draw it back into the right place in order for the woman or the person with the uterus to be happy and healthy again. That it shows really how ignorant they were about about women's bodies or about uterus and ovaries and all this kind of thing. So ancient Greek and Roman doctors believed that if you put something nice smelling up your nose and something horrible smelling up your vagina, or the other way around, it would draw your uterus back into the right place. But really, the ultimate cure, they believed, was getting married and having a baby, of course. Otherwise, you would go mad and throw yourself down a well. So these ideas, they were still going right up into the 19th century. And they tied in, well, they really inspired these ideas about hysteria that doctors were sort of developing at that time. Again, kind of relating women's issues back to their, uteri. And different techniques were developed to cure hysteria. Again, it was all very much about getting married and having babies, but if you couldn't do that, doctors would actually masturbate the patient themselves and, actually probably sexually violating many of their patients. And this is why vibrators were invented as an easy way for doctors to make hysteria patients orgasm. It's completely ridiculous. We know that is totally false. But it's really interesting to see how these kind of ideas about gender lasted for hundreds, thousands of years, essentially, without changing. So I have we have a replica of one of the objects that we have in the Objects of Power section, which is an ex voto ceramic figurine of a uterus and bladder. It's Roman. It's made of terracotta. It is 15 centimeters long, 10 centimeters wide, and it's kind of the shape of a small football, if you can imagine that. It has curvy horizontal ridges on it that you can sort of run your finger down. They're quite deep and sort of feel those. And it is made of terracotta, so it's a sort of, terracotta color. These ex voto figurines, they were, or votive, if you like, in plain English, were left as offerings for various gods and goddesses of healing. For example, Asclepius. And they were often left by women who who thought that their womb was wandering, because that's what doctors said. So they'd often leave these kind of offerings to help them heal, and also to help them get married and have babies, because of course that is what you should do. So in the exhibition itself, we have a small amulet of Joan of Arc, which was collected by the museum in 1901. And when I say small, it is very small. It is 4 centimeters high and 1.4 centimeters wide. It is made of a silver metal, and it shows Joan of Arc in sort of full battle gear with Joan holding a weapon. And so in the exhibition itself, we haven't given Joan a pronoun, because Joan has really become a symbol for so many different identities and groups, from lesbian, trans, asexual, schizophrenic even. Joan is a hero for so many, so we thought it would be kind of more respectful not to give Joan a pronoun in the exhibition. So Joan is very much related to, well, histories of gender, histories of sexuality, and of course, histories of witchcraft, and the witch in the bottle, which we've also looked at. As I said, Margaret Murray wrote about Joan of Arc in her witch cult theory of Western Europe. Arthur Evans wrote about Joan of Arc in The Witchcraft and the Gay Counterculture. And in 1936, Vita Sackville-West, the queer author, writer, and one-time lover of Virginia Woolf, actually wrote a book about Joan of Arc, taking quite a lot of inspiration from Margaret Murray's work. And in her book, she really frames Joan of Arc as a lesbian, as having sexual relations with other women, and looking at Joan as kind of more cross-dressing, or Joan as more kind of dressing in a butch fashion, rather than actually being trans. And again, this book became very popular. It was obviously later refuted academically, because we don't know the truth about Joan. And I think that's the really interesting thing, is that, since we don't know the truth, Joan can be a symbol of power for so many. Something I was really interested in doing as a researcher was connecting objects that the Pitt Rivers Museum already had to contemporary LGBTQIA+ culture, whether that be activism or whether that be things like TV shows. And so I had to include one of my favorites, which was Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but in particular, the lesbian witch couple, Tara and Willow, who were the first long-term lesbian couple on mainstream TV, which is a really important point. This is kind of in the late 90s, early 2000s. And growing up, they were such a huge inspiration to me, and it was so nice to sort of see myself represented as I was growing up and discovering my own identity. And so, of course, they also connect to these stories of the LGBTQ community, particularly the lesbian and bisexual community, and witchcraft. It was really nice to see myself represented on TV, and it was really nice to see these kind of histories of witchcraft being connected to the LGBTQIA+ community in the media.
So hi, I'm Hannah Bruce. I was the project officer on Beyond the Binary, and I'm here to talk to you a bit about the phone box behind me, which I'll describe in just a second. I'll describe myself as well. I've got quite dark brown hair and an undercut. My hair is up in a kind of like man bun, as some people might say. And I am of dual heritage, part Indian, part white, British. So I've got kind of olivey skin, and I'm wearing all black, which is very typical of me. And so I'm going to talk to you a bit about the phone box behind me. First off, I'll give you a description of it. So it is essentially the same size of a kind of a normal phone box. If I had to approximate, maybe like 9 feet, but someone could tell me if that is wrong. And it is in vibrant pink, blue and white colours, which are the colours of the trans flag. It's not the same as an actual phone box. It's a kind of replica that we got, so it's made out of lighter material. It's not quite as heavy, it's a bit more movable, but it has a door which opens, so you can actually go inside, and it is also absolutely covered in stickers, which have different kind of messages, like basically around kind of trans power and stuff, which is what I'll tell you about the origins of this phone box. So a couple of months into my role as project officer, I was walking on my way to work, and there were some very horrible transphobic stickers up on Parks Road, which is literally where the museum is. So I obviously was taking them down, but they were pretty much cropping up every day, every couple of days. And I noticed that other people had been kind of like taking them down and had been putting up like sticker responses, essentially, kind of saying cats for trans rights and trans joy is real and all of these kind of messages, which was, really amazing to see that kind of response to these kind of like hurtful, hateful stickers that have been cropping up. Kind of, again, probably like a month into this, I bumped into someone who was doing these responses to the kind of the negative, the transphobic stickers, and we got to talking about it, and we discussed how the phone box on Parks Road was very much, at least at the beginning, a kind of a focal point for the story. It was where, in fact, they first did a kind of a sticker response to the person or persons who are putting up these transphobic stickers. So we were discussing about, I mentioned that I was a part of an exhibition at Pitt Rivers, literally, 100 yards away, and we discussed like, very much I wanted to bring in things that were happening like right now. I'm sure so many people saw these stickers around in Oxford but didn't know anything that was like actually underlying and why it was happening. Because it's worth saying that after a couple of months, the kind of the sticker thing got massive. There were so many people responding. There was so much kind of like trans joy stickers, but also so many more people involved in taking down the hateful stickers, as they unfortunately also increased. So we were like, maybe we could create a space that is purely for the support for trans people, the place where the transphobic people, the TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists, can't reach, and to make sure that people understood what was happening if they just were walking past and like, what are all these stickers about? You know, and I think it's important because, well, as we know in the media and everything else, there's a lot of hate towards trans people, which is completely ridiculous and like very much kind of fabricated stories. So really important to give space like this at the Pitt Rivers Museum that can be a safer space. So the stickers on the phone box now and that were around kind of all of Oxford, it really kind of expanded all across the city centre and kind of beyond, were of such a variety of things and were really fun and joyful and caring and sharing such a positive message. And on the phone box in the exhibition, we've invited loads of people to submit their own stickers. So it is covered in stickers. So if I were to describe each one of those, I would be here for a while. And I kind of love that the community and allies can kind of take the power back, you know, and give the power to the community. So yeah, there's also a TV inside with different videos, which kind of showcase the journey of what happened with the stickers from someone else's point of view. And the very much integral to all of this was at Stickers for the Win on Twitter. You should give them a follow. They've really captured the whole story in Oxford of the kind of the Twitter story, because yeah, literally like transphobic people were, and we don't know if it was like one person or if it's spread, but very much at the beginning it was like every morning and late afternoon they were going up, and they were also would take down all of the kind of trans joy stickers and the kind of positive messages. So it really became this kind of weird kind of dialogue that only actually stopped because of the pandemic, which is, you know, but it's worth saying that just because that stopped doesn't actually mean that the hate, that that kind of stuff isn't still there and just presenting in another way. So I really just mainly hope as an exhibition this gives a space for people to feel proud of who they are, to feel connected to other people, to feel, you know, cared for, to feel, you know, hope and joy and everything like that. So for me, the phone box really encapsulates that.
Hi everyone, my name's Beth Asbury and my pronouns are she, her. I've got short silvery hair and I wear glasses. I'm here in the Beyond the Binary exhibition space because I used to work here at the Pitt Rivers Museum. I was responsible for Beyond the Binary's predecessor project Out in Oxford. Out in Oxford was launched in 2017 and it was an LGBTQIA+ trail of all of the university's collections. In my right hand, I'm holding the trail booklet. It's A5 and has a white cover. And in the middle, or towards the top, is the Out in Oxford Trail logo, which was designed for us by a fantastic local youth group called My Normal. It's a big black capital Q with rainbow stripes through the middle. So when we were working on Out in Oxford, there was a story that we really wanted to tell as part of the trail, but we couldn't because at the time there were no objects on display related to that story. But fortunately, a few years ago, since Out in Oxford was launched and before Beyond the Binary came into being, a new run of archaeology display cases was installed on the top floor of the Pitt Rivers Museum. Now, the row of cases, they're called desktop cases by members of staff. They're kind of waist height with a glass top. And at the end of the row, in a triangular shaped case, is a square box about 18 centimetres across by about 6.5 centimetres deep. And it's a hinged wooden box made of a sort of a red-brown coloured wood. Inside the box are some round slots containing 23 copper discs. They're about palm size. They're sort of medals or medallions. Pitt Rivers, the general Pitt Rivers, after whom the museum is named, owned this box and the medallettes. And the box also contains quite chunky looking metal die, which was used for stamping those discs. Pitt Rivers is sometimes called the father of British archaeology. And one of the things that he was keen on doing was exploring various scientific techniques for archaeological fieldwork. On one side of those metal discs are 6 different symbols related to archaeology. There's a pick, a theodolite, which is a kind of measuring device, a human skull, a vase, an axe and a sword. On the other side of the coin are his name and his post-nominals, FRS, for Fellow of the Royal Society, which he was very proud of. So when Pitt Rivers backfilled one of his excavation trenches, when he closed them up, he would have the side of those discs, those copper alloy medallions, stamped with the date that he closed the trench, and he would sort of pop them in so that future excavators would know that he'd been there first and he dug that site already. So what's that got to do with queer history, I'm sure you're wondering? Well, the box and its contents were donated to the museum in 1971 by the General's great-grandsons, Anthony and Michael Pitt Rivers. In March 1954, Michael Pitt Rivers was involved in a very high-profile court case with his cousin, Lord Montague of Beaulieu, and their friend Peter Wildblood, who was a journalist. It was, as I say, a very high-profile court case that got an awful lot of media attention because they were quite well-known figures in British society at that time. And unfortunately, all 3 of them were convicted and sent to prison for homosexuality. However, because of a public backlash against these witch hunts, as they were seen, in America they were known as the Lavender Trials, there was a backlash of public opinion against the vilification, if you like, of homosexuals in the UK. And a few months after the Montague case, as it was known, what was known as the Wolfenden Committee first met. So this was in September 1954. A few years later, in 1957, the Wolfenden Committee recommended the decriminalisation of homosexuality. They stated that homosexuality between consenting adults should be decriminalised, should be legalised. Unfortunately, it wasn't for another 10 years in 1967 that the law was partially changed in England and Wales. But Lord Montague has made public statements about how proud he is that their court case eventually had a positive impact on the changing of the law for homosexuals in the UK. And what about Michael Pitt Rivers? He married Sonia Brownwell, who was the widow of George Orwell. Unfortunately, their marriage didn't last and they did get divorced, but Michael spent most of his life with his partner, William Grono Davis, I think that's how it's pronounced, and he was an artist. I hope they had a really happy life together.
Hi, my name's Andy Mcclellan. I'm Head of Public Engagement here at the Pitt Rivers Museum. I'm 192 centimetres tall, which in old money is 6'1". I've got dark hair. I am of medium build, I would say. Other people might call me a bit bigger than that. I'm wearing a blue jacket and a blue shirt and beige jeans. I've been involved in the Beyond the Binary project, and I think it's really changed the way the museum is thinking. Quite often in museums, we choose to tell one story, and all museums tell the same stories, and actually there's a lot of different stories out there, and Beyond the Binary has been an opportunity to tell some of the stories that have not been told in this space before. So the first object I'm going to show you is a Javanese shadow puppet. It's in a case on the middle floor of the Pitt Rivers Museum, and it's in a case with lots of other shadow puppets from Thailand and China and different parts of the world. The puppet I'm talking about is a figure called Sri Candy, and it's sitting at the bottom of the case and is made from buffalo skin. When I think of that puppet, it appears to be made of cardboard and looks really delicate. but actually it's incredibly strong when you hold it, and it's quite rough to the touch. It's got very long, thin arms and a solid body. It appears to be a female figure wearing a dress and a blouse, and it has long, extended fingers and feet very close together. It's got the head slightly downturned with a long, quite pointed nose and thin almond-shaped eyes. And in Java, that kind of character is perceived to be alus, and alus is calm, and alus is what you aspire to be. So it's a beautiful puppet, and the almond-shaped eyes and the downturned face show that the puppet is in control of what's going on around it. The puppet has lots of holes punched through the leather, so that when you hold it up, the light goes through the puppet and makes beautiful patterns onto a screen behind it. The sticks that are holding the arms and the legs are made from stretched water buffalo horn. The figure is wearing traditional Javanese clothes, so it's a sarong in patterns of dark green, light green, and flecks of yellow and white, and the blouse is in the same colour. And the figure itself, the skin is painted gold, so it really stands out, almost glows in the area. When I think of no binaries in relation to this puppet, I'm not necessarily thinking about LGBT stories, because Javanese shadow puppets are made in Indonesia, the most populous Muslim country in the world, and they're used to tell ancient Hindu epic stories. And in these times when we often see religion as being very polarised, what the Indonesian shadow puppets can show is a cultural appreciation and assimilation of different religious heritages and stories. And it's a wonderful kind of coming together of cultures. So that's one of the non-binary stories. Now, in the Mahabharata, Sri Kandi is born as a woman and then becomes a man. And that's an important statement about the history of third genders within non-Western cultures. We often look at gender through a Western eye, but the rest of the world doesn't necessarily see it that way. So historically, within Indian culture and Indian stories, there is a third gender, and Sri Kandi can represent that. It's also interesting that within Java, where the wayang kulit shadow puppets are really culturally important, they're often one of the few ways of telling political stories or political satire. And Sri Kandi, as a puppet that starts as woman and ends up as man, becomes a symbol of transgender politics within contemporary Java. So we have these multi-layers of stories around Sri Kandi that makes this a truly non-binary figure. The object I'm going to talk about is the witch in a bottle. The witch in a bottle is in a case on the ground floor of the Pitt Rivers. It sits alongside other objects to do with the evil eye, and opposite a case on witchcraft. Now, we don't know very much about this witch in a bottle. We know what it says on the label, and the label says, collected in 1915 from an old lady living in Hove in Sussex, and she said, they do say there be a witch in it, and if you open it up, you'll get a peck of trouble. Collected in 1915 by Margaret Murray. We have nothing else in our database about it, so all we can do is really conjecture about what this object might be and what it might really have been. Now, that works very well for visitors coming into the museum because it allows them to impose their own stories and their own thoughts onto this object. But how the museum chooses to display it also imposes some kind of story onto it. So just slightly further down, in I think 2 cases further down, are some German stoneware bottles that were originally beer bottles, and they are known as witch bottles, and we know exactly what those are because we've opened them up and we've looked inside. And through the 18th century, they were used particularly in London and Norfolk and areas like that. And you put often some urine, some pins, something made of steel, and burnt things inside. You seal it up and you put it under your doorstep, or you put it in the wall of your house, and it's a protection against witchcraft. And they're known as Bellamines. But this bottle isn't that. It doesn't look like that. And the witch bottles are generally all about the same. So if this isn't that kind of bottle, what is it? So does it really have a witch in it? Well, we've never opened it, so we don't actually know. I have picked it up. I'm one of the few people who've held it. So when people are looking at this, we're thinking about often, if it's people coming in from a British cultural heritage, going to be thinking about how we consider witchcraft in this country, which will be about kind of TV programs or films that include witches. But for other people, it represents a kind of anti-Christian view of the past and an othering, that witches were people that sat outside society. They're the people that didn't fit. They're the people who'd done something that meant they were accused of wrongdoing and might get burnt at the stake or dipped in the pool or excluded from society in some way. And we know that quite often the people who were excluded in that way were women, either because they didn't fit because they were now too old, or they didn't fit because there was something about them that didn't fit society's norms, and that was often around gender or sexuality. So the idea of witches, for quite a lot of people, is about that othering, about the fact that they don't belong in society, and that has created a strong link between LGBT communities, and particularly lesbians, and the idea of witchcraft. And this witch in a bottle can represent that story, and that's one of the non-binary stories that can be told about the witchcraft objects from the UK that exist in that area of the museum. Yeah, I thought it was interesting that both Mara and I chose to talk about the witch in a bottle, and I think we've chosen to talk about it in quite different ways. And I think that really illustrates that importance of having different perspectives and different voices within the museum, because each one of us brings a slightly different view and a slightly different angle. I was also really pleased to see that one of the artists we work with, Sarah Joy Ford, responded to The Witch in a Bottle in an art piece that they made to go into the exhibition, which is an embroidered cover with images of all sorts of objects from the museum, and quite prominent on it is the witch in a bottle.